Hey, it's Mike with High Intensity Health. In this video, I'm going to share with you some shocking facts about genetically engineered foods and your health. You may not know it, but the average American is consuming their body weight equivalent in genetically engineered foods every single year. In fact, 73% of brain samples contain the genetically engineered ingredient called glyphosate, which is a potent pesticide and herbicide that's found in genetically engineered foods and other foods that are sprayed with this chemical. You might be wondering, well, what's the problem of consuming this chemical? What does that really do to me? Well, studies have shown that this chemical suppresses your phase 2 and phase 1 detoxification enzymes, which is a huge problem. If you can't detoxify these different environmental compounds, you're going to bioaccumulate them, and we know that a lot of these different compounds have estrogen-like mimics, and they bind to the estrogen receptors and are linked with estrogen dominance, various cancers, and much more. So that's a major problem. The other problem is these genetically engineered components, particularly glyphosate, has been shown to be a mitochondrial poison. And we know our mitochondria are so critical. These are cellular organelles that help us to burn fat. They help us to aerobically break down the glucose and carbohydrates that we ingest. They help to make cellular energy. So if you have mitochondrial dysfunction, you're going to store more fat, you're going to be metabolically dysfunctional, and probably have prediabetes, insulin resistance, and poor exercise tolerance and low energy. That's a huge thing for a lot of people, and also neurologic challenges. Our mitochondria are critical for optimal brain health. So you definitely want to minimize your exposure to these compounds and find ways to upregulate your body's elimination capacity to detoxify glyphosate and other environmental compounds that we will discuss in this excellent webinar taught by my friend and integrative functional medicine expert, Dr. Alex Vasquez. He has over 3 different doctoral degrees. He's a doctorate in chiropractic medicine, naturopathic medicine, and osteopathic medicine, and has authored many books on this topic. So I really hope you enjoy this, and if you have any comments or feedback, please type it in below, and subscribe to the YouTube channel if you want early access when we launch new videos. So hope you enjoy and take care. Hey everyone, welcome back. It's Mike Muffalo and Alex Vasquez. We're going to talk about the mitochondria and inflammation today. Super excited for that. So Alex is going to share all the work that he's been doing recently and get us up to speed on some really complex and cool concepts that you can use. So just a little bit of background, if you guys don't know, Dr. Vasquez holds 3 doctoral degrees. He has his doctorate in chiropractic medicine from University of Western States, also his doctorate in naturopathic medicine from Bastyr University, and his doctorate in osteopathic medicine from University of North Texas Health Science Center, Texas College of Osteopathic Medicine. So Dr. Vasquez is the author of many textbooks, including Integrative Orthopedics, Integrative Rheumatology, Musculoskeletal Pain, Integrative Medicine, and Functional Medicine for Chronic Hypertension, and his latest book, Functional Inflammology, which we're going to dive into. He's also written more than 100 letters and articles for professional magazines and medical journals, including the British Medical Journal, The Lancet, Annals of Pharmacotherapy, Journal of Clinical Endocrinology, Metabolism, and much more. So Dr. Vasquez, welcome.
Thank you, Mike, and thank you for hosting this and putting it together. I know we've talked over the last day or two about a couple of different topics that we could cover, and I think, as you just mentioned, everybody wants to talk about mitochondria. So I'll do that, and I'm going to put kind of an interesting spin on that. And then towards the end, Mike, if you want to direct the conversation in a certain way, we could go through certain protocols, and we can pretty much talk about anything within the framework of time that we have. So as Mike knows, what I did this morning is I just put a few slides together. So I wouldn't necessarily call this completely informal, but I'm not going to call it completely formal either. So these are just slides that I had handy, and I put in a few new ones. I always like to look at things visually rather than just kind of talk off the cuff, so to speak. I guess I'll just take the reins, and if Mike wants to chime in, he can certainly do that. So today is one of the first days here in October of 2014, and here are a few items that I'd like to review. And again, this is kind of an informal review of what I consider to be some important ideas.
And our theme right now is going to be food labeling and mitochondrial toxicity. The connection between those two things might not be obvious to you, but it is obvious to me, and I'll show you why it's so obvious in just a moment. Our next theme is going to be immunonutrition, and what I've done is provide a major update to my antiviral protocol that I initially published in 2009. You can see the most current version of this right now in Rheumatology Books version 3.5. This will be available in a digital download format, and the automatic updates will be provided to you, and you won't have to repurchase the antiviral protocol once it's in this new digital format. You can subscribe to receive updates automatically to your Kindle, computer, or iPhone, or other smartphone. What we're going to talk about right now is genetically modified food, and the reason this is of pressing concern right now is, as I'm sure most of you know, or many of you know, Oregon is about to have a major ballot initiative for the labeling of genetically modified food, so I thought we might as well talk about that topic since it's very timely. Speaking of time, you can see this article published 2 years ago by the Environmental Working Group in 2012 showing that Americans eat their weight every year in genetically engineered food. Now, one analogy that's been used to describe the situation is that it's basically an experiment on the entire population to have them eat these genetically modified or manipulated foods because, as you can see at the bottom of this page, shockingly, virtually no long-term health studies have been done on the consumption of genetically engineered food, and yet we collectively are allowing Americans to eat an estimated 193 pounds of genetically engineered food per year. So I think that does qualify for a nationwide experiment. As you can see here from the OregonRightToKnow.org website, they are preparing for a major ballot vote by the people on this topic. As you would expect, the corporate interests are putting millions of dollars into this. Meanwhile, we've got concerned citizens, doctors, and scientists on the other end who, of course, don't have deep pockets like that, but would still like to defend the American right to know what people are actually eating. I think we would all agree that few rights are more fundamental than knowing what we're putting in our mouth, and some people would have it such that you wouldn't know what you're putting in your mouth. Could be genetically modified or manipulated foods with the associated chemicals. And actually, for the subject of this video, the focus on chemicals is actually going to take center stage in just a moment. Here's another resource you can use. This is one of the television stations in Oregon, Coin 6, and you can see some information that they've provided on their website, whether or not to label these genetically manipulated foods. Again, considering the fact that Americans are eating their entire body weight in these foods, actually more than their body weight in these foods, I would think that based on basic principles of medical ethics, for example, one of those principles is autonomy. Well, people cannot make autonomous decisions if they don't have the information upon which to base those decisions. So, I mean, if we look at the topic of genetically modified food labeling from a medical ethics standpoint, then it's pretty much a no-brainer that in order for people to make independent and autonomous decisions, again, when we look at the pillars of medical ethics, autonomy is usually listed as the first of those pillars. People can only make autonomous decisions if they have appropriate information. So by blocking people from having that information, we're basically depriving them from an ethical standpoint of being autonomous human beings. Furthermore, if we look at some more research, such as what I've presented to you here, this is an article from Scientific American. Weed-whacking herbicide proves deadly to human cells. And the herbicide in question, of course, is glyphosate, which other research has shown suppresses the cytochrome P450 detoxification system and would therefore be expected to contribute to other diseases. One of those conditions could be, and this is somewhat theoretical, but it could be associated with the increased incidence lately that we've seen of celiac disease and gluten intolerance, as well as other food allergies. Here's the original article actually showing that glyphosate in a very low concentration, a 450-fold dilution, caused DNA damage in human tissue cultures. So that would correlate, of course, therefore, with anticipated damage in following human exposure. Many of you who are familiar with my work know that I have focused over the last couple of years on the topic of inflammation. I recently updated my work in a textbook of about 700 pages called Functional Inflammology, with a short excerpt from that book on dysbiosis in human disease. I've recently updated my integrative rheumatology textbook as Naturopathic Rheumatology version 3.5, and an excerpt of this material is also available in a shorter book called Functional Medicine Rheumatology 3.5, but that represents the most current manifestation of my functional inflammology protocol and paradigm. One component of that model is mitochondrial dysfunction. You can see this article that I published in Alternative Therapies in Health and Medicine in January of 2014. Mitochondrial medicine arrives to prime time in clinical care. So I invite you to take a look at this article. It's available on the website page that you can see at the bottom of this screen right now. One of the components of mitochondrial dysfunction is another topic called endoplasmic reticulum stress, which I've diagrammed here from my books. And you'll see that one of the contributors to endoplasmic reticulum stress is xenobiotic exposure. Xenobiotics are foreign chemicals like herbicides, pesticides, things that we're exposed to, and those cause not only mitochondrial dysfunction, but also a relatively newer topic that we're increasingly concerned with called endoplasmic reticulum stress. Again, this is well drawn out in my books. Endoplasmic reticulum stress leads to something called the unfolded protein response, which is basically a pro-inflammatory response that contributes to mitochondrial dysfunction, and then mitochondrial dysfunction also creates a vicious cycle here that feeds back into endoplasmic reticulum stress and additional oxidant stress and inflammation, as you can see diagrammed here. So mitochondrial dysfunction is considered to be a pivotal component of sustained or chronic inflammatory disease. And I've diagrammed that here, again, from one of my more recent books, or actually several of my more recent books. So what I'd like to help you do right now is understand the connection between mitochondrial dysfunction, food choices, and chemicals in the environment. So here I've got a picture of Colombian corn. I'll tell you about some things that have happened here in Colombia recently. Back in America, the trend, of course, has been the consumption and production, and therefore, of course, profitable sale of these genetically modified foods. You can see here these were mostly introduced into the market around 1996. And now, by 2014, genetically modified soybeans are almost 100% of the soybean market in the U.S. You could say the same thing for genetically modified cotton. It's getting pretty close to 100%. And also BT corn and HT corn, if you look at those are at least 80% now of the American food market. And I know that many of us love nature and many of us are passionate about healthy foods, but the fact is the environment's become contaminated with these chemicals associated with the planting and raising of genetically modified food. So I'd like to talk about what some of the possible implications of that could be. If you look at this article from Environmental Toxicology and Chemistry in June of 2014, you see that glyphosate and its degradation product, AMPA, were detected in more than 75% of air and rain samples. And you can see that the chemical mix that patients are exposed to just in their rainwater, river water, and air, and this was done in Mississippi, so this is representative of a portion of the United States. You can see that this chemical soup that people are having to drink and breathe is dominated by glyphosate. So I think we'd all reasonably have some reason to be concerned about this. If people are drinking and breathing and eating glyphosate, then we'd want to know what that does. Here's an article that you can download from the internet for free called Detection of Glyphosate Residues in Animals and Humans, showing that food animals and farm animals and, of course, humans are beginning to show signs of accumulating glyphosate. And again, this is largely associated with the planting of genetically modified foods. One of the concerns that we've had here in South America is the fact that genetically modified foods and the chemicals that go along with them have been incorporated into some free trade agreements. And when this was starting to be implemented in 2013, it left a lot of the poor farmers kind of in a state of panic because they couldn't afford the chemicals that go along with these foods. They were being forced by law to destroy their own food supplies, and so they protested and tried to get some public sympathy for this, and that cost the lives of 12 people who were killed during the protests. If you want to see this information online, you can certainly do that. I've given you the address here of a video that describes what happened. You can also look here in a magazine called Rolling Stone. which describes the U.S. Colombia Free Trade Agreement, along with the requirement that these poor campesinos, the farmers, have to use genetically modified foods, or seeds, I should say. They have to use genetically modified seeds engineered by international conglomerates like Monsanto and DuPont. If you want more history on kind of what's happened between the U.S. and South America, a series of videos is available. And you can see this one in particular, America's Backyard, Colombia, along with this other documentary, which was actually done by a local college student, talking about what happened when the national farmers were forced to destroy their own food supply in favor of these genetically modified foods. My concern is looking at the research and showing what might be a consequence of exposure to these associated chemicals. So what I will invite you to do is pause the video anytime you want if you want to look at the details of this research. What I'm going to show you are abstracts or summaries of research, and all of these are derived exactly as they were published in the database run by the United States Library of Medicine. So I encourage you to take a look at the source if you'd like to do that. Let's fast forward and focus in on the combination of glyphosate with a so-called inert chemical called TN20, which, as you can see from the bottom line, aggravates mitochondrial damage and induces cell death either via apoptosis or necrosis. So that's another piece of support we have, supporting our concern about this whole chemical soup that people are eating, drinking, and breathing. You can see here from Environmental Toxicology and Pharmacology 2012 September, another step toward glyphosate-induced epidermal cell death, mitochondrial and oxidative mechanisms. Here's the article that I had summarized previously from its original text, showing that a 450-fold dilution of spraying of glyphosate was shown to cause DNA damage in these epithelial cells from humans. Here's another article from Chemical Research Toxicology 2009. Glyphosate formulations induce apoptosis and necrosis, so that basically means cell death, in human umbilical, embryonic, and placental cells. And finally, let's look at one of the earlier articles on this topic, published back in 2005, showing uncoupling of oxidative phosphorylation secondary to exposure to Roundup, which is a herbicide formulation that includes glyphosate along with other so-called inert chemicals. So what the research has basically shown is that glyphosate has a certain level of toxicity, but when it's mixed in with other chemicals in this formulation, it's even more toxic than any of the individual chemicals would represent if tested by itself. Oddly enough, and in direct opposition to medical ethics, the American Medical Association has come out against labeling genetically modified foods, which is odd because, as I mentioned before, one of the pillars of medical ethics, which is the standards that medical physicians are supposed to follow, one of the primary pillars of medical ethics is autonomy, and we all know that one of the components of autonomy is education, so that if people don't even know what they're eating, then they cannot possibly make autonomous decisions. So the fact that the American Medical Association would come out against labeling genetically modified foods is actually contradicting the very premise of medical ethics. And it's not the first time that that's happened. If you look at this article from the American Journal of Public Health, it documents the connection between the American Medical Association and the tobacco industry, wherein the American Medical Association used to have a very comfortable financial relationship with the tobacco industry. Again, you can look at the history of this in the American Journal of Public Health, February 2006 edition. You can also just look on the internet and you can see evidence for the tobacco industry and the American Medical Association working together. You can also access a very excellent book called Serpent on the Staff, The Unhealthy Politics of the American Medical Association. So again, my main concern is the treatment of inflammatory diseases, and we all within this work appreciate the role of mitochondrial dysfunction. And therefore, if we're going to appreciate the role of mitochondrial dysfunction, then we of course have to appreciate the role of xenobiotics, which includes herbicides and pesticides, within this pathogenic model of sustained or so-called chronic inflammation. And when you look at it from that perspective, this important topic of labeling genetically modified foods and therefore allowing the consumer base to be aware of what it's eating and the chemicals it's being exposed to, I think becomes very relevant. Again, Americans are eating their body weight in these genetically modified foods every year. Associated with these foods are glyphosate and other chemicals. You can see that these chemicals are becoming very permeating throughout the environment, now being found in more than 75% of air and rain samples, according to this study conducted in Mississippi, published in 2014. So I think we have some legitimate reasons to be concerned here. So again, I invite you to look at that research. For those of you who are clinicians, you might want to look at some of the protocols I've recently published on inflammation and rheumatology. And that pretty much summarizes what I wanted to say in today's update. I just covered food labeling, again encouraging you to support the measure in Oregon. Whether you live in Oregon or not, I think we all need to show some national solidarity as Americans and work together. This is not just a individual city or individual state issue. It's an issue that affects everyone in the nation. And so I just wanted to provide some support and an update on that topic of food labeling and how that is connected with mitochondrial toxicity via the chemicals that are applied to those foods.
So having covered that topic rather quickly and perhaps somewhat informally, I'll open it back up to Mike to see if he has any questions and other things that we might discuss today.
Yeah, that was fascinating. You did a great job of going through that research, and a lot of that I have not heard about, the connection between leaky mitochondria and GMOs and then glyphosate. So let's talk about that. You talked about the ER, the endoplasmic reticulum, which is where a lot of the proteins are made and how that creates inflammation. And we also talked about leaky mitochondria and all the diseases linked with mitochondrial dysfunction. So the ER stress and the mitochondria are interconnected and woven together. Do you think, in your opinion, that the GMOs and then the surfactants and solvents found and so forth are causing cell membrane damage, including the ER and the mitochondria?
Well, I don't have an opinion on it necessarily. So let me show you. Let's go back to that diagram. Let's go back to this diagram. Let's use this kind of as the basis of my way of answering the question. I mean, I could say yes or no, but what I think is more accurate would be just to kind of represent the data. And so let's use this model, which I think is a good summation of the data. And if we look at the inputs that cause mitochondrial dysfunction and endoplasmic reticulum stress, and again, realizing that those can, once that cycle is initiated, that can perpetuate itself. What are the inputs that cause that problem? Well, let's look at all the inputs. So the main inputs at the top are fuel overload, xenobiotic exposure, and microbes. So when we talk about, genetically modified foods, and then we see the other, fallout from that, which is oxidant stress and inflammation, which I'll talk about in just a moment. But in terms of, glyphosate and the chemicals, that would fall into the category, of course, of xenobiotic exposure. And I think we're seeing data now that suggests, it doesn't suggest. What the data shows is that humans are accumulating these toxins. They're exposed to them. They're accumulating them. It's in the rainwater. It's in the air. So it's not like eating an organic diet. That data was from Mississippi. So we don't want to necessarily say, well, it applies to the whole world or applies to the whole United States. But let's say you're a person in Mississippi, and you're eating an organic diet, and you're exercising, and 75% of the air and water that you're breathing contains glyphosate. And the data shows that glyphosate is a mitochondrial toxin. I mean, imagine what it would be like to be that person, trying to be healthy, maybe trying to combat a family history or a genetic predisposition towards diabetes, hypertension, obesity, Parkinson's disease, Alzheimer's, any of those conditions associated with mitochondrial toxicity. And basically, since this is an informal conversation on a Saturday, whoever that person that, this stereotypic person is that we're talking about, I mean, they're basically screwed, right? They could consume the right supplements, they could exercise, they could eat organic foods, and they're still breathing and drinking glyphosate, right? Well, then the question becomes, well, how much are they exposed to, and is it, physiologically relevant? Well, in one of the studies that we looked at, a 450-fold dilution was still shown to have some, adverse effects. So, if we were to implement what's often called the precautionary principle, then I think we need to implement some precaution around the overuse of glyphosate, which is just becoming rampant in the environment where it's applied. And I think that's, we see it used internationally. I mean, everybody knows that. But, what does that say if we are internationally applying this chemical that's potentially mitochondrial toxic? That could spell problems for a lot of people,
Absolutely. Like you said, that patient in Mississippi or Alabama or anywhere really in the world now, according to the research, could be exposed to these things. And along those lines, what I hear a lot of practitioners say is 5-10 years ago, I could have put someone on a detox program, a multivitamin, a fish oil, got them exercising and sleeping, and whatever they were, suffering or coming in with, whether it be autoimmunity or depression or diabetes or obesity, would, have been resolved. But now, they're doing everything. They're doing gluten-free, dairy-free.
Mm-hmm.
All these different things, and more and more nutrition, and these patients are getting harder and harder to treat, so to speak,
right,
or get back to optimal health. So
sure,
this GMO and glyphosate component throws in a whole other curveball because, like you said, everyone's being exposed to it, and people are
right,
accumulating or consuming their body weight in equivalent in GMO foods per year. So, Alex, so what do we do about this?
I think the point that you just made, I think, is really good, and I think you just articulated something that, for example, that I had been thinking of as well lately. For example, like when I was going through naturopathic school and first studying, nutrition under Jonathan Wright and Alan Gaby. This was back in 1994 when I first started accessing their materials. I'm agreeing with you in that, things seem to be so much simpler there. I remember some of the treatment protocols that we used to use were way simpler now. I mean, if you look at my functional inflammology protocol, for example, with all due respect for my own protocol, because I think it's good and I don't think I overdid anything. I mean, it's a pretty complex protocol, and like you just said, it's almost like we're kind of thinking about the earlier times when things used to be simpler. It's like, wow, we used to treat people with diet and exercise and they got better, and then we used some supplements and then we used fatty acids and it seemed like people got better. And now it seems like we're just seeing these more and more complex conditions, and we have to keep doing more and more and more to get patients better. I think that's a really important point, Mike, that you just made. So I do appreciate that. In terms of what to do about it, I think the answer to that's usually pretty obvious. And by the way, I think I'm one of the only people who's been saying this, at least in the functional medicine world. And I do remember saying this at a presentation I gave for IFM it would have been back in 2004, so exactly 10 years ago. One of the things I said back then, and that was before, even at that point, we were being exposed to glyphosate and we were being exposed to GMO foods, but none of us really understood it. It was kind of under the radar. But what I said back then is the same thing I'll say, 10 years later, and that is, the requirement is that we all collectively have to be, more politically active, socially active, informed, but not simply informed. And we have to do more than just post things on Facebook, right? I mean, and there are different ways to be active, but a lot of what people consider to be political activism these days is just they're like what I call Facebook activists. They post things on Facebook, and that's important to distribute information, but at some point we all have to do more than that. And, what is the more that we can do? Honestly, I think at times the question isn't as clear as it used to be. Just like you were saying about treating patients, what we used to do when we wanted to change politics is we just voted and things got better. Well, we don't see that working anymore. So, one of the things people can do, for example, and I really think this is important for, let's say most of your audience is mostly, healthcare professionals and such. I mean, people have to get off their butt, basically, and they've got to start paying money out of their pocket to support, public initiatives, for example, to get GMO foods labeled. So, for example, to get GMO foods labeled is not saying anything bad. It's a very clean thing to do. It's not saying anything bad about GMO. It's not saying anything bad about glyphosate. It's not saying anything bad about the government or Monsanto or DuPont or any of these companies. It's just saying, look, let's honor reality and let people choose what they're eating. I mean, the fact that people can't even be informed about what they're putting in their body when those choices could be potentially negative, that's a metaphor for that, which I don't think is too extreme. it's kind of like forcing people to chain smoke without letting them know. It's like, oh, we're replacing your fresh air with glyphosate and tobacco smoke, but we're not going to let you know. You know, that would never be allowed to happen. So why is it being allowed to happen in a slightly different manner? So, you know, I think people have to get off their butts. And let me use a personal story in that regard, because this was actually kind of touching. Last month or the month before, you know, when the Ferguson riots were happening, I remember spending at least a whole day, if not more than that, you know, watching what was going on, because I thought, you know, there'd be more riots, and I didn't know if the riots were going to spread through the U.S. or what was going to happen. It seemed like the whole thing was pretty volatile at the time. And I remember telling a friend of mine, who was also one of my professors in naturopathic medical school, I remember telling him, I said, wow, I said, I feel like I wasted a whole day, you know, just paying attention to all this political chaos and, you know, all these social concerns. And he came back with a very important reply, something to the effect that, you know, it was almost like, well, what could be more important than, you know, the stability of your country and some of these human rights issues that are going on? And so what that communicated to me is that we all have to get off of our intellectual high horses and the way that we're used to living our lives. You know, I think the way that, and this, you know, this ultimately does go back to what you had said earlier about treating patients. We have to accept the fact that things are changing, and the political climate's change. You know, climate change itself as a, you know, temperature and you know, melting of the ice caps. That whole thing. I mean, these are not theories anymore. Times are changing radically right now, and we have to adapt to that, and we have to live differently. And part of what that means is we have to carve out time to pay attention to what's going on in the world. Otherwise, things are just going to continue to get worse. And that also means, you know, paying money to support groups, for example, who want to support GMO labeling. I think that's a very reasonable thing to do. And, you know, I think the whole political situation has just gotten really cloudy, and it's cloudy on purpose. I mean, things are messy. It's not just cloudy, it's messy. And I think people have to adapt to what's going on, get off their butts, get out of their usual habits and say, look, I'm going to commit a day a month, a day a week, or something. But they have to commit time to being socially engaged. Otherwise, nothing's going to change. And otherwise, you know, the corporations in the U.S. have so much power these days. If people don't get engaged and become citizens that are engaged in the political process more than just voting once every 4 years, then I don't, you know, if that doesn't happen, then things are not going to change for the better, you know. And here's another thing, and this ties back to what I had said, you know, 10 years ago when I was lecturing for IFM. We have to start protecting more than just our patient base as clinicians. So one of the things that's bothered me about functional medicine, and I mentioned this recently in my book, I mentioned it in the article that I published in January in Alternative Therapies in Health and Medicine, we have to look beyond our patients and become more publicly involved if we're going to advocate appropriately for the same patients that we see. One of the things that's bothered me, and this is true, this bothered me a bit about naturopathic medicine too, but it's even worse in the functional medicine community. And that is, let's say we become experts in detoxification, and let's say we devise these really brilliant detoxification protocols. At the best, we're only helping the better educated, more affluent people who come to see us. You know, we're not doing anything to support true health on a population-wide basis. It's kind of like sitting back and letting the problem fester, and then when those few patients come in, the rich, educated patients trickle into our offices, then we say, oh yeah, well, I'm going to help you detox. Well, what about the poor people out there who never come to our offices, you know? We're just kind of profiteering off of a broken system if we sit back, do nothing, and then say, oh yeah, well, I've got a detox program, but it's going to cost you, you know, $1,500. I mean, if we're really going to have integrity as healthcare professionals, then we've got to do more than just see the patients who come into our office and pay us, you know. We've got to advocate for public health. And, you know, not everybody wants to hear it, not everybody wants to do it, but the fact is, that is reality. If we simply do nothing and let this problem fester and then say, oh yeah, well, if you're rich and educated, you can come to my office and pay, $10,000 for a detoxification program. I don't really feel like that's doing healthcare justice. And specific to the functional medicine model, that is not how functional medicine was originally discussed and designed. Back in 1994, for example, when Jeffrey Bland gave a really brilliant presentation called Advancement in Clinical Nutrition, the goal at that time, and that was when, functional medicine as a model was still pretty fresh. It was pretty new back in 1994, so that's 20 years ago. The whole conversation was treating patients, preventing disease, supporting healthy environments, and having a healthcare model that would provide more effective care at less cost. And now you see functional medicine doctors, they just run these boutique practices, and they're charging, sometimes more than $10,000 per visit. That is not functional medicine the way it was designed, So, I think everything I've said today could probably should be reviewed within the context, and I think if it's reviewed within context, people will understand what I'm talking about. Functional medicine has to be more than just giving people nutritional supplements and telling them to, meditate and drink green tea, if we're going to say that the human experience is an integrated, multidimensional experience, then we need to go ahead and pay attention to each one of those facets in our patients, but also, appreciate that, kind of like you and I have already said today, Mike, we're getting to the point now where the environment is so toxic, we've got to wake up to the fact that, we as healthcare professionals have some responsibility, to the world or to the population more than just having a successful practice, We can't rely on, if the EPA, for example, were doing its job, you wouldn't have 75% of air and water samples contaminated with glyphosate. And that's just one chemical out of the thousands that could have been tested, right? So, the idea that we're all going to sit back and have private practices and do primary care and just take subjective, objective assessment and plan, formatted healthcare interventions, those days are over. That's not healthcare anymore. That's a simplistic model of healthcare that I think is rapidly becoming outdated. We've got to do more than simply assess and treat individual patients when we see these problems becoming so wide on a population scale, So,
no, completely agree. And let's dive into some of these strategies that we can do. So we
Sure.
talked about avoiding GMO foods, which we should encourage everyone to do. Buy local foods, buy organic. But if there are exercise, lifestyle, dietary strategies that we can implement to either increase the elimination of glyphosates, factants, and different, what would you recommend and why?
Sure, I think that's a great question. So obviously, as you just said, what can we do to avoid this problem? Well, first of all, treating it at the root, at the cause, which is consistent with the functional medicine model, would be, stopping the exposure that we have to these things. Again, and when you look at a chemical being in 75% of air and water samples, organic diet is not enough anymore. I think back in the day, maybe it was all an illusion all along anyway. But we used to say, well, just eat organic. Well, you can't breathe organic these days. You can't drink organic water these days because it's all contaminated. People can, eat organic. You can use a water filter at home. Of course, that only helps people who are rich and have enough money to do those things. And I mean that. We can't just select who's going to survive. And if we look at detoxification programs and if we look at eating organic, you're basically self-selecting for rich people because the poor people aren't going to have the option to eat organic and, get a solid carbon filter for their water. Certainly take vitamin and mineral supplements to support the whole detoxification process. Exercise, a lot of these toxins like BPA are eliminated through sweat, so exercise is certainly important. As far as binding on to the chemicals, we can't talk about binding until we talk about detoxification. So if we talk about, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then hepatobiliary excretion of these toxins, we have to support each one of those phases. So usually that means vitamins and minerals for phase 1, protein, amino acids, conjugating agents, glutathione for phase 2, making sure that people aren't on drugs that block phase 1, or making sure they don't have microbial exposures like small intestine bacterial overgrowth that slows down phase 1. Making sure their mitochondria are sufficient to support phase 3, I think that's more or less a given, but not always. And then, importantly, binding these toxins when they're in the gut, we call that blocking intrahepatic recirculation or intrahepatic recycling. And, the two best agents for that are cholestyramine, which is a prescription kind of adsorbent resin that usually gives people some degree of gastrointestinal upset. But if they take that 4 times a day, that's been shown to help clear out these toxins. Not glyphosate in particular, but other pesticides and herbicides, where it's been studied in certain case reports, for example. But I think something that is perhaps underutilized, but also highly effective, is chlorella. Chlorella, taken 3 times a day with meals, that's 2 grams 3 times per day for a total of 6 grams per day, has been shown to help people detoxify dioxins, for example. And that's based on human studies. It's been supported by some animal studies because the chlorella binds onto these toxins when they're in the gut and helps support fecal excretion by blocking intrahepatic recirculation. So I think that is something people can do, and these days probably something that people should start doing. I mean, the data is very clear. I mean, and this goes way beyond glyphosate that we talked about today, but I mean, the data is very clear that, especially, and I don't want to say necessarily, especially Americans in a way that might sound like I'm picking on Americans, because I'm not, but there's been a lot of data published in the American population, so that's why I'm referencing that particular group. I mean, Americans have a lot of chemical and pesticide toxicity, and so you could easily justify, routine use of some type of gastrointestinal adsorbent like chlorella, or, perhaps to a lesser extent cholestyramine, to help people detoxify, because the environment, food supply, air, water, it's all toxic. And, I think we're seeing, as you had said before, Mike, and I had said this before as well, why are we seeing mitochondrial dysfunction now in ways that we weren't aware of it, or we didn't see it, 5-10 years ago. And I think we're starting to appreciate that these so-called persistent organic pollutants are frequently, if not exceptionally and usually, mitochondrial toxins. And I think that's part of the reason why we're seeing so many of these mitochondrial-related disorders these days. So those are a few things people can do, but I don't think anybody would be a fan of cholestyramine long-term. I just reviewed this topic recently for a patient that I just had actually yesterday who's had some toxic exposures. From what I've seen, most studies have used it, or most clinicians are expecting to see pretty good results within 2 weeks. But as I'm sure we all know, patients can't live the rest of their life on cholestyramine. So then the question becomes, how can we help people take advantage of using cholestyramine, or how can people get the advantage of cholestyramine, even though we, of course, all acknowledge that people can't take it forever? Well, one of the things that I think people can do, in addition to just supporting their detox pathways and urinary alkalinization and all the things that I've documented in my protocols, is use cholestyramine, for example, like maybe 1 week per month, or even a couple of days per month. It doesn't have to be done on a consecutive basis. They could do cholestyramine on Saturday and Sunday, and then Monday through Friday they could use chlorella. That would be a reasonable approach to kind of rotate these adsorbing agents in such a way that people have their detoxification pathways supported and promoted, but without running into the consequence that they might otherwise run into with long-term drug usage. With cholestyramine, it's not very well absorbed. It stays in the gut. It just binds onto things, but it does cause some GI upset or constipation in a good proportion of patients. So they can increase their intake of magnesium and vitamin C and fiber and vegetables and exercise and things like that to kind of offset that constipating effect. But I think that's becoming, reasonable and realistic. The data is very clear that, people are more and more chemically exposed and more chemically toxic, and these toxins have consequences. So if all of that's true, and if we're going to accept reality at face value, which has always been my approach, then we have to act on that data. We can't just take in the data and say, oh yeah, well, it's true, but we're not going to do anything about it. I mean, we have to do something about it.
I love it, Alex. That's really good advice. So as we part ways here, let's say hypothetically you were in an elevator with Barack Obama and you had 45 seconds to give him some advice on some health tips that could improve the longevity and overall healthcare burden in America. What would you tell him?
Wow, that's a heavy question to spring on me at the last moment, but let me see what I can come up with. I'd paraphrase my introduction, and I would say something like, Mr. Obama, with all due respect, sir, if I might have your attention for the short elevator ride that we're going to share together, gosh, then I'd have to pause, and I'd hit the pause button on the universal time clock and see what else I could come up with. So what is the ultimate answer here? Whew, that's complicated. I mean, the ultimate answer, things are so complicated, Mike. I mean, this goes back to what you had said before. There is no one answer to this, you know. I could throw in a few ideas that I've thought of, which I haven't mentioned today. First of all, in terms of healthcare models and in terms of healthcare paradigms, and I have said this either in lectures and in my books, I mean, the only models that are going to support sustainability of healthcare systems and life in general are the functional medicine model and or the naturopathic medicine model. I mean, those are the only two models of healthcare that are inclusive enough to prevent disease, promote optimal wellness, and, as is becoming more and more important, I mean, we've got to maintain survival of our species. That is not something I think we can really take for granted anymore. You know, the way politics and the world and the environment is changing so quickly, I think we need to do some damage control, and we need to do some stabilization. Like, if you look at healthcare, if you look at international politics, if you look at the world, global health, etc., if you look at all of that as a patient, our patient's crashing. I mean, we've got a patient in the ER right now, and those vital signs are not looking good. Okay, so before we do anything else, as a nation, as a society, as healthcare professionals, we've got to do some damage control, you know? And part of that, I realize I'm giving you an answer that's much more complex than you perhaps were looking for, but there is no simple answer to this. Number one is we've got to accept reality for what it is, and we've got to look at the fact that things are getting bad really quickly, you know? I mean, that's the fact. If anybody wants to bury their head in a mocha and a stupid television show or whatever, or a shopping spree or whatever, I mean, those days are kind of getting passé. I mean, that's like old hat. I mean, reality's knocking on our door louder and louder every day. So, number one, accept reality. Number two, agree that we've got to deal with it. And number three, get in some different opinions, some opinions that actually have perspectives that are sustainable. And here's kind of what I'm pointing to when I say that. When you look at the people who are promoting, or who are resisting, I should say, like labeling GMO foods, like they're politicians and people who have no training in nutrition. Why, for example, in the U.S., why are the people who are leading the FDA and in control of the nation's food supply, why are they, tied in with corporations rather than, why aren't they like PhD people who in nutrition, or clinical nutrition? So, one is we have to substitute politicians for experts if we want expert level information to be implemented into national policy, which is obviously not happening these days. Anyway, it's a mess, Mike. That's my ultimate answer. Like, as far as what I could say to Obama to fix things, I'd say we got to do some damage control, and we've got to get this. We got to stabilize this patient before we can talk about turning this patient into an athlete. We got to stabilize the patient. I love it. I think we've got to see more activism on the part of organizations to, not in a way that's combative, but just in a way that's realistic. I mean, look at the research I presented today. That's not some super stealth, secret archive of information. All of that is publicly available on through the U.S. Library of Medicine, and I don't know why other people aren't accessing that information and kind of bringing it to the fore of discussion. So I think my ultimate answer, even though I would love to have a really witty answer to your question, is there is no simple answer here. I mean, we've got to rewind this mess that's been created over the last couple of years. And the mess is, I mean, look at how permeating the mess is, Mike. I don't know if you, I don't know, I realize you and I grew up in two different states. I grew up in Texas. But when I was a kid in like elementary school, we got out there and sweated every day, and that was called physical exercise, PE, physical education, Kids these days don't even have physical education classes. So, I mean, the whole structure that once promoted health, whether it was healthy foods, organic foods, normal foods, exercise, I mean, the whole structure of a health-promoting society has been destroyed. And now we're basically on a salvage mission trying to patch things together. And that's why I can't even come up with a simple answer to your question, There is no simple answer. We've got to rebuild society based on, and I've started to write an essay on this, which I haven't published yet, but we're at a point now where we have to rebuild society. We're not at a point where we can patch up a few things. We've got to start from scratch and say, look, what are the goals we have as a society, as a human species, as a nation? What are the goals that we have? If it's self-destruction, then let's keep doing exactly what we're doing. If it's survival and optimization of our human experience, then we have to totally change course from what we're doing right now, because the course we're on right now is nothing but destruction.
Yeah, well said. So Alex, as we part ways here, what are some ways that our listeners can touch base with you and find out more about your work online?
Sure. Let's see. On the screenshot that we're looking at right now, it's got a picture of the book cover and my website. My website's Inflammation Mastery. Some of these books are either available on my website or mostly on Amazon.com. For example, the Naturopathic Rheumatology and Functional Ophthalmology. Those are on Amazon. For patients who want a consult, if they go to my website, Inflammation Mastery, I've got a link there where they can sign up for a consult. I also have a separate website just for patients called healgrowthrivemedicine.com. That's HEAL, healgrowthrivemedicine.com. That's for patients. But you'll see the same page on my Inflammation Mastery. If you go inflammationmastery.com/consultations, I believe that will take you to the page where patients can sign up. So that's another option. People can email me. I've got email addresses on my websites. And I think that would be a reasonable way for us to take it from there.
Alex, really appreciate this. You covered so much great information. So I'll also post all the links to your books as well on highintensityhealth.com/DRV for Dr. Vasquez. And thanks so much for joining us today and covering such a vast topic and breaking it down into sound bites so we can all take action steps and improve the lives and community and society that we live in. So hope you have a fabulous day.
Thanks, Mike.